High in the Andes, where the air is thin and the wind never stops whispering through the rocks, there was a village that time had almost forgotten. It clung to the side of a steep mountain like a patch of lichen, small, quiet, and tough. The people there had lived the same way for generations, planting potatoes in narrow terraces carved into the slope, herding llamas over rocky paths and watching the clouds roll in from the east like slow-moving ships. But this year was different. The rains never came. At first, no one panicked. Dry spells happened. The elders would say, "The mountain is just resting." They'd burn a few coca leaves, pour a little chicha, corn beer, onto the earth as an offering, and wait. But weeks turned into months, and still the sky stayed clear and cruel. The streams that once sang through the valley fell silent. The soil cracked open like old pottery. Even the hardy quinoa plants, usually stubborn enough to grow in stone, curled up and died. Hunger crept in quietly. It didn't shout. It just sat at the table, thinner each day, until the children's ribs showed through their shirts. The village storehouse, once full of dried potatoes and corn, was nearly empty. People began eating the seed stock, knowing it meant no planting next season, but what choice did they have? A baby cried all night, not from colic, but from thirst. Its mother tried giving it weak tea made from boiled grass, but it only made the crying worse. The village school teacher was a young man who'd left years ago to study in Cusco, then returned because he couldn't bear to be away from the mountains. He wasn't a leader, not officially, but people listened when he spoke because he knew how to read, how to write, and most importantly, how to use the old shortwave radio left behind by a missionary decades ago. It sat in his one-room house covered in dust, its dials stiff with age. No one had used it in years. The batteries were long dead. One evening, after walking the whole village to check on families, he came home with his hands shaking, not from cold, but from something deeper. He'd held a child that afternoon whose eyes were too big for its face. That look stayed with him. He cleaned the radio with a cloth, found a few working batteries in a drawer, and spent hours trying to get a signal. Static hissed like angry snakes. He twisted the dial slowly, whispering into the microphone, "This is Quarapata. Does anyone hear? We need help. Please." He repeated it over and over, changing the frequency, adjusting the antenna made from a bent coat hanger and copper wire. His voice cracked. He wasn't used to begging, but this wasn't pride, it was survival. Far away, in a city where streets were paved and lights never went out, a man monitoring emergency frequencies heard a faint, broken voice speaking Quechua mixed with Spanish. He didn't understand all of it, but he caught the words, "no water, children sick and dying." He wrote down the coordinates, passed the message up the chain. Within days, it reached an international aid group already working in the region. They had supplies. They had planes. They had hope. Back in the village, no one knew any of this. Life went on in slow motion. Women ground what little grain they had into flour, stretching it with ash and clay to make flatbread that tasted like dust. Men walked for hours to distant springs, only to find them dry or fouled by dead animals. The elders gathered each night around a small fire, not to talk, but just to sit together in the silence that comes when words fail. One morning, the school teacher climbed to the highest ridge, where the wind was strongest and the view stretched for miles. He looked up at the stars, brighter here than anywhere else on earth, and whispered the old prayer his grandmother taught him. "Apu Ausangate, Father of snow and stone, hear us. We are your children. Send rain. Send life." He didn't expect an answer. But that night, as he lay on his thin mat, listening to the wind rattle the tin roof, he thought he heard something else. A low, distant hum, like a giant bee flying far above the clouds. He sat up, heart pounding, but the sound faded. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks, or maybe, just maybe, someone had heard. The next morning, a boy tending llamas near the eastern pass saw something strange in the sky. Not a bird, not a cloud, but a metal bird, huge and silver, glinting in the sun. It circled once, twice, then dropped something that fluttered down like a giant seed. The boy ran back to the village, breathless, shouting that the sky had given them a gift. People gathered in the square, eyes wide. The object was a crate wrapped in bright orange fabric tied with thick rope. Inside were packets of white powder. "Milk," the schoolteacher read aloud, voice trembling. Small bottles with red crosses on them, and strange boxes with tubes and filters. There was also a note printed in Spanish. "From the hands of those who care. More is coming. Tears fell before anyone could stop them. An old woman kissed the crate. A man dropped to his knees and pressed his forehead to the ground. They didn't know who these helpers were, where they came from, or why they'd answered. But in that moment, it didn't matter. The stars had listened. The mountain had sent aid. The schoolteacher stood apart, watching the joy unfold. He felt relief, yes, but also a quiet knot of worry in his stomach. Nothing in this world came without a price. Still, as he watched a mother mix the white powder with boiled water and feed it to her child for the first time in weeks, he pushed the doubt away. Maybe this time it really was a gift. Night fell again. The wind still blew. But for the first time in months, the village slept without fear. Somewhere above, the stars blinked, cold, distant, but no longer silent. And far away, engines roared to life on a runway, preparing to bring more than just supplies. They were bringing change. And change, even when wrapped in kindness, can be the most dangerous thing of all. 3 days after the first crate fell from the sky, the noise returned, but this time it didn't fade. It grew louder, deeper, shaking the ground like thunder that wouldn't stop. People ran outside, shielding their eyes against the sun, and saw it. A great metal bird, bigger than any they'd ever imagined, hovering just above the valley like a god deciding whether to land. It wasn't a bird at all, of course. It was a helicopter, painted white with a blue symbol on its side that looked like clasped hands. It circled once, then lowered slowly onto the only flat patch of land near the village, kicking up dust and scattering the few remaining llamas. The blades kept spinning, making a sound like 1,000 angry bees. As 2 figures stepped out, they wore clean clothes, stiff, bright jackets, boots that didn't look like they'd ever touched mud, and caps pulled low over their foreheads. One carried a bag, the other a camera. They moved quickly, purposefully, as if they owned the air they breathed. The villagers stood back, silent, watching. No one approached. No one knew what to do. The schoolteacher stepped forward. He'd brushed his only good shirt, combed his hair, and practiced what to say in his head a dozen times. "Welcome," he said in Spanish, his voice steadier than he felt. "We are grateful." The taller of the 2 men smiled, a quick practice thing, and shook his hand. "We're with the Global Aid Initiative," he said, speaking fast, like he had a schedule to keep. "We heard your call. We're here to help." Help. The word felt warm like fresh bread, but something in the man's eyes, sharp, scanning, always moving, made the schoolteacher pause. Still, he nodded and led them into the village. What followed felt like a dream. More crates arrived by helicopter over the next 2 days, stacked high with sacks of rice, tins of beans, bottles of medicine, and even small solar panels. A woman with kind eyes and a stethoscope around her neck examined the sick children, gave out pills, and showed mothers how to mix rehydration salts. She spoke slowly, smiled often, and let the children touch her shiny watch. For a while, it really did feel like salvation. The outsiders set up a tent near the old stone well and called it a clinic. They handed out flyers with drawings of clean hands and boiling water. They took photos, so many photos of villagers holding food, smiling, even when they didn't feel like it, standing beside the new water filters that looked like strange metal mushrooms. "For our reports," they explained. "To show others how your lives are improving." At first, everyone cooperated. Who wouldn't? These people had come from the sky with food in their hands and hope in their voices. The elders, though quieter than the rest, watched from their doorways. They didn't trust the cameras. In their stories, spirits that demanded your image could steal your soul. But the children didn't care about old warnings. They ran after the aid workers, laughing when the woman gave them candy, wide-eyed when the man showed them how a tablet could play music without a radio. To them, these strangers were magic. The schoolteacher helped translate, explained how the water purifiers worked, and even let them use his house as a temporary office. He believed in this. He wanted to believe. Yet late one night, as he sorted through donated supplies by lantern light, he found something odd tucked inside a box of bandages, a folded map of the region, marked with red circles around certain hills, including the sacred ridge where the village buried their dead. He stared at it for a long time. The circles weren't labeled clinic or water source. They were labeled Zone A, Zone B, with notes in neat handwriting, high mineral signature, potential lithium deposit. Lithium? That was for batteries, for phones, for machines in faraway cities, not for villages with no electricity. His stomach tightened. The next morning, he asked the aid team leader about it. The man didn't flinch. "Oh, that?" he said, waving a hand. "Standard geological survey. Part of our environmental assessment. We have to understand the land before we build long-term projects." "Long-term projects?" the schoolteacher asked. "Exactly," the man said, smiling again. "We're not just dropping food and leaving. We want to stay, help you modernize, build a real health post. Maybe even a school with computers." The word sounded good, but the schoolteacher noticed how the man's eyes kept drifting toward the eastern ridge, the one with the red circle. That afternoon, the woman medic gathered the women of the village to teach them about hygiene. She spoke gently, showed them how to wash wounds with clean water, how to spot signs of infection. But then she asked them to sign papers, simple forms, she said, just to track progress. Most couldn't read, so they pressed their thumbs into ink pads and stamped the pages. The schoolteacher watched from a distance. He knew what those papers really were. Releases, permissions, maybe even land agreements disguised as gratitude. Still, he said nothing. Not yet. Because that same day, little Rosa, barely 5, who hadn't smiled in weeks, drank clean water from the new filter, ate rice with beans, and fell asleep without coughing. And when her mother hugged the medic, tears streaming down her face, the schoolteacher felt his doubts shrink, just a little. But then came the incident with the water. The filters worked too well. The water they produced was so pure, so empty of minerals, that the villagers' stomachs, used to the iron-rich, slightly muddy water from mountain springs, couldn't handle it. Within 2 days, half the children had diarrhea. One baby grew so weak they had to carry him for hours to the nearest town with a real hospital. The medic treated them, gave them special salts, assured everyone it was just an adjustment period. But whispers started. "The sky water makes us sick. The strangers don't know our bodies." Even the elders, who had stayed quiet, began murmuring about broken balance, how you can't replace the mountain's gift with a metal box. Then one evening, old Thomas, who had questioned why the aid team kept photographing the burial grounds, didn't show up for the nightly fire. His family said he'd been taken the night before by men in dark uniforms who spoke no Quechua, only sharp Spanish commands. They dragged him away after he refused to let them walk on the sacred stones. No one saw him again. The schoolteacher went to the aid camp the next morning, heart pounding. "Where is Thomas?" he demanded. The team leader looked surprised. "I don't know who that is. He's one of us. He spoke to you yesterday," the man shrugged. "We don't handle security. That's the regional authorities. Maybe he broke a law." "There are no laws here but ours," the schoolteacher said quietly. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes this time. "Things are changing," he said. "You'll get used to it." That night, the village didn't gather around the fire. Doors stayed shut. The joy had curdled into something sour, fear wrapped in confusion. The gifts were still there, the food, the medicine, the clean water. But now they came with silence, with missing neighbors, with maps marked in red. The schoolteacher sat alone on his roof, looking up at the stars. They seemed colder now. He remembered begging them for help. And help had come, but not the kind he imagined. These people weren't cruel, not exactly. They smiled, they worked hard, they saved lives. But they also took things, trust, land, peace, without even realizing they were taking them. And the worst part? Most of the villagers still believed in them. They still called them the ones from the stars. They still thanked them every morning. Only the schoolteacher saw the truth. Sometimes, the most dangerous visitors aren't the ones who come with guns. They're the ones who come with kindness and never ask what you're willing to lose in return. The aid camp grew like a strange new plant in the middle of the village, bright, orderly, and out of place. Tents became wooden sheds. The single water filter turned into a row of them, humming softly day and night. A satellite dish appeared on a pole, pointed at the sky like a metal flower chasing the sun. Everything looked clean, efficient, helpful. But beneath the surface, something was rotting. The schoolteacher stopped sleeping, not because of the noise. The generators were quiet enough, but because of the silence that followed. No one talked openly anymore. When villagers passed each other on the path, they nodded but didn't speak. Eyes dropped. Shoulders hunched. Fear had settled in like morning fog, thick and hard to shake. He tried to warn people gently. "Be careful what you sign." he'd say when someone showed him a new paper. Ask what those machines are really for. He told the boys who watched the outsiders drill small holes in the hillsides, pretending it was soil testing. But most just shrugged. They gave us medicine, they'd reply. They saved Rosa. They're good people. And they were, on the surface. The medic still treated the sick. The team leader still handed out rice with a smile. But the school teacher saw what others missed. How the leader's eyes lingered on the eastern ridge every morning. How the drills went deeper each week. How the temporary camp now had a locked metal shed no villager was allowed near. Then came the day the mountain screamed. It started with a low rumble, so deep it vibrated in your bones, not your ears. People dropped their tools and ran outside. The sky was clear, but the ground trembled like it was breathing. Then came the sound, a sharp, tearing crack, like the earth itself was splitting open. From the ridge above the burial grounds, a plume of dust rose into the air. Moments later, men in hard hats emerged, laughing, slapping each other on the back. They'd set off explosives, small ones they claimed, to test rock stability. But they'd done it right beside the ancient stone shrine where generations of ancestors were honored. The blast had shattered the main altar, scattering sacred stones down the slope like broken teeth. An old woman who'd tended that shrine for 40 years fell to her knees and wailed, a sound so raw it made even the aid workers stop and look away. The village gathered, not in anger yet, but in stunned grief. This wasn't just rock. It was memory. It was prayer made solid. The school teacher walked up the path alone, his boots crunching on the debris. He found the team leader standing near the crater, clipboard in hand, jotting notes. You knew this place was sacred, the school teacher said, voice low but steady. The man didn't look up. We had permission. From who? Your regional council. Signed documents. There is no council here. Only us. The man finally met his eyes. Then maybe you should have organized one sooner. That night the elders held a meeting in the old stone circle, the one that hadn't been touched in centuries. Firelight flickered on their faces, deep lines carved by wind and worry. They spoke in Quechua, words heavy with sorrow and rising fury. They treat our home like empty land, one said. They think because we live simply, we have nothing worth protecting. Another elder, her hands gnarled like tree roots, held up a handful of the blasted shrine stones. This is not dirt. This is our blood in the earth. By dawn, a decision was made. They would block the road. Not with violence, with presence. They would stand, old and young, and say, no more. The next morning, before the sun cleared the peaks, the villagers gathered at the narrow pass that led down the mountain, the only way vehicles could come or go. Men, women, children, even the sick wrapped in blankets. They formed a line across the dirt track, arms linked, silent. They carried no weapons. Only their bodies, their voices, and the weight of generations. The aid team arrived an hour later in their white truck, surprised to find the road closed. The team leader stepped out, calm at first. What's this about? He asked as if they were late for a meeting. The mountain is not for sale, the schoolteacher said, standing at the front. We're not selling anything, the man replied, frowning. We're helping you. Then stop digging. Stop taking pictures of our dead. Leave the ridge alone. The man's face hardened. You don't understand what's at stake. This project could bring electricity, jobs, real development. We already have life, someone called from the line. We don't need your kind of progress. For a moment it seemed like the man might listen. He glanced at the faces, wrinkled, sunburned, determined, and hesitated. But then he shook his head. You're being misled, he said. This isn't just about you anymore. There are bigger plans. He got back in the truck and drove away, kicking up dust. 2 days passed. The villagers stayed at the pass, rotating shifts, sharing food, singing old songs to keep their spirits up. Hope flickered. Maybe they'd won. Then, at sunrise on the third day, the sound returned. Not a helicopter this time, but engines. Heavy, grinding official. 2 military jeeps rolled up the road, soldiers in uniform stepping out with rifles slung over their shoulders. They didn't shout. They didn't argue. They just walked forward, pushing people aside with gloved hands. Step back, one said in flat Spanish, by order of the regional government. The villagers didn't resist. They couldn't, but they didn't move fast enough. A young man trying to shield his grandmother raised his hands and shouted, "This is our home." A soldier shoved him. He stumbled, fell. Someone else cried out. Then before anyone could stop it, a shot rang out. It wasn't aimed at anyone. Just a warning, the soldiers later claimed. But the sound alone was enough to shatter the morning. Then another shot. And another. When the dust settled, 3 people lay on the ground. Not dead, but bleeding. One with a leg wound, another with a graze on the arm. The third, a teenage girl, unconscious from the panic and the fall. The soldiers loaded them into a jeep and drove off, saying they'd be taken to a hospital. The rest of the villagers stood frozen, staring at the red stains on the dirt. The silence that followed was deeper than any drought. Back in the village, the schoolteacher sat in his house, hands shaking. He opened his journal, the one with the cracked leather cover, and wrote 2 words at the top of a fresh page. Deathworlders. He didn't mean monsters. He meant people from a world so broken, so hungry for more, that they couldn't see life unless it served a purpose. To them, a mountain was not a spirit, it was a deposit. A village was not a home, it was a location. A prayer was not sacred, it was noise. That evening, the aid team packed their tents. Not all of them, just the core group. The medic stayed behind, treating the wounded, her eyes red from crying. "I didn't know," she whispered to the schoolteacher. "I swear I didn't know they'd bring soldiers," he believed her. But belief didn't heal wounds. As the helicopters returned to lift the rest of the team away, the villagers watched from a distance. No one cheered. No one cried. They just stood, hollowed out like trees after a fire. The crates of food were still there. The water filters still hummed. But the trust was gone, burned away in a single morning of gunfire and silence. And high on the ridge, the shattered shrine lay in pieces, waiting for hands that might never come to rebuild it. The helicopters left behind a silence deeper than any the village had ever known. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the kind of quiet that settles after a storm has washed everything away, leaving only questions and broken things. The aid camp stood half dismantled, its bright tents flapping in the wind like empty skins. The solar panels still caught the sun, but no one turned them on. The water filters sat unused even though the streams were still dry. No one wanted anything that came from those people anymore. The wounded had returned from the hospital, bandaged, thinner, quieter. The girl who'd fainted now startled at the sound of footsteps. The man with the leg injury limped when it rained, which he said was the mountain weeping for what had happened. They didn't speak much about the soldiers or the shots or the ride down the mountain in the back of a jeep with metal walls and no windows. But their eyes said enough. The schoolteacher walked the village every day, not to teach. There were no lessons now, but to listen. He sat with families as they stirred thin soup over low fires. He held the hands of elders who whispered, "We should have never let them near the ridge." He watched children flinch when a distant plane passed overhead. The fear had roots now. It wasn't going away. One afternoon, he found the medic still in her small tent near the old well. She hadn't left with the others. She was packing slowly, folding blankets, labeling medicine bottles to leave behind. Her face was tired, her uniform stained with dirt and something darker. Maybe blood, maybe mud. "I tried to stop them," she said without looking up. "When I heard the jeeps coming, I called my supervisor. I begged them to wait to talk. They said it was beyond my level." She laughed, but it sounded like a cough. "I thought I was helping. I really did." The schoolteacher didn't blame her. He could see the guilt in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled as she sealed a box of antibiotics. "You gave medicine," he said gently. "You held children when they cried. That was real. But it wasn't enough," she replied. "Because the rest of it, the drilling, the maps, the soldiers, that was real too. And I didn't see it until it was too late." She left the next morning before sunrise, carrying only a small bag. She left behind all the medicine, all the supplies she could. On the clinic table, she left a note. "For those who still need healing, forgive me." The village buried it in the earth along with the memory of trust. Days turned into weeks. The drought didn't break, but something else did. The illusion that help from outside would save them. People began to turn inward to what they'd always had, each other. Women revived old ways of stretching food, boiling wild roots, drying cactus fruit, grinding stones to make flour from the last of the seed potatoes. Men repaired ancient irrigation channels by hand, using ropes and memory instead of machines. Children learned to gather dew from leaves at dawn, drop by drop into clay bowls. It wasn't easy. Some nights, hunger still gnawed like a rat in the walls. But there was a new kind of strength in the work, a quiet pride in surviving without strangers watching, measuring, taking. Then came the rumors. Travelers from Lower Valley spoke of big meetings in the city, government officials, foreign companies, aid groups all talking about the Carapata project. They said the mountain was rich in something called lithium, needed for batteries in phones and cars far away. They said the land might be reclassified for national development. One man even claimed he'd seen blueprints. Roads, fences, a processing plant right where the burial grounds used to be. The school teacher knew then that this wasn't over. The Deathworlders hadn't left for good. They'd just gone to plan their return. He gathered the villagers one evening, not in anger, but in warning. "They'll come back," he said. "Not with food this time. With papers, with guards, with promises we can't refuse. They'll say it's for progress, for the country, for the future." "And what do?" asked a young father holding his sleeping son. "We remember who we are," the schoolteacher answered. "We write our own story. We protect what's ours not with guns but with truth." So they began to document everything. The elders spoke their histories into a small recorder the schoolteacher had saved from the aid camp. Women drew maps of sacred sites on scraps of paper. Children collected stories from their grandparents, tales of the mountain's moods, the spirits in the springs, the songs that called the rain. It wasn't a weapon. It was a shield made of memory. They also sent word to other villages, to lawyers in Cusco who worked with indigenous rights, to journalists who might listen. Not begging this time, just stating facts. This is our home. These are our dead. This land is not empty. Months passed. The first rains finally came. Not a flood, but a gentle, steady fall that soaked the cracked earth and made the first green shoots push through the dust. People stood in the downpour with their faces turned upward, not praying for rescue, but giving thanks for what they still had. Then, one morning, a car appeared on the distant road. Not a military jeep, not a white aid truck, but a dusty sedan with 2 people inside. They weren't wearing uniforms. They carried notebooks, not rifles. They asked to speak with the village, not to give orders, but to listen. The schoolteacher met them at the edge of the village. "Why are you here?" he asked. "We heard your story," said the woman, her voice soft. "We want to help you tell it to the world, your way." This time he didn't say yes right away. He brought them to the elders. They spoke for hours in Quechua and Spanish under the shade of the old stone circle. No cameras, no forms to sign, just talk. And for the first time in a long time, the schoolteacher felt a flicker of something he hadn't dared name. Hope. Not the kind that falls from the sky in crates, but the kind you grow yourself slowly, from the ground up. The Deathworlders had come with noise and promises and left with silence and scars. But the village was still here. The mountain still stood. And now they were learning to speak, not to the stars but to each other and to anyone willing to truly hear. Years passed and the mountain forgot nothing, but the world below kept turning. The village of Carapata never grew large. It never got electricity lines or paved roads or a clinic with bright lights, but it didn't vanish either. It stayed, small, stubborn, alive, like a seed that refuses to stop growing even in cracked stone. The schoolteacher was older now. His hair had streaks of gray and his hands were rough from more than just writing. He still taught the children, but the lessons had changed. Now, along with reading and numbers, he taught them the names of plants that heal, the old songs that call the rain, and the stories of the ridge where their ancestors slept. "Remember," he'd say, "help isn't always kindness, and kindness isn't always help." One dry season, a stranger came, not in a helicopter, not in a jeep, but on foot, with a backpack and tired boots. He carried a notebook and a camera, but he didn't take pictures right away. He sat in the square for 2 days, drinking bitter tea with the elders, listening more than he spoke. On the 3rd day, he asked to speak with the schoolteacher. "I'm writing about places the world forgets," he said, "but I heard this village didn't forget itself." The schoolteacher studied him, the lines around his eyes, the way he held his cup like he respected it. "What do you want to know?" he asked. "The truth," the man said. "Not the version from reports or news clips, yours." So they talked. Not in one afternoon, but over weeks. The schoolteacher told him everything. The drought, the crates from the sky, the smiles that hid maps, the blast that broke the shrine, the silence after the shots. He didn't speak with anger. He spoke like someone describing a storm that had passed, the damage it left, the lessons it carved into the land. The man wrote it all down. When he finally left, he promised the story would be told as it happened. No heroes, no villains, just people trying to survive in a world that often sees the poor as empty spaces to fill. Months later, an article appeared in a magazine read by people in cities far away. It didn't go viral. It didn't change laws overnight. But it reached the right eyes. Lawyers, teachers, other villages facing the same quiet invasions. Letters began arriving in Kurapata, not with aid, but with solidarity. "We stand with you," one read. "Your mountain is not alone." The government never came back with soldiers. The mining company shifted its plans to a less complicated region. Maybe it was the article. Maybe it was the quiet network of villages now sharing stories and legal advice. Or maybe it was simply that Karapata had become too well known to disappear quietly. Life settled into a new rhythm. The rains returned more reliably. The terraces filled with potatoes again. Children laughed louder, not because they'd forgotten the past, but because they'd learned to carry it without bending. One evening, as the sun painted the peaks gold, the schoolteacher climbed to the old ridge. The shrine had never been fully rebuilt. Some wounds don't close, they just scar. But around the broken stones, someone had planted small wildflowers. They bloomed every spring, bright and defiant. He sat there for a long time, watching the clouds drift. He thought about the night he'd begged the stars for help. How he'd believed salvation would come from above, clean and certain. How he'd been both right and wrong. Help had come, but not in the way he expected. It hadn't arrived in crates or helicopters. It had grown in the hands of mothers sharing their last bread, in the voices of elders refusing to be erased, in the quiet courage of a village that chose to remember instead of disappear. The stars still shone above, distant and silent. They hadn't answered his prayer with miracles. They'd answered it with something harder, truer, the chance to protect what mattered even when the world said it wasn't worth saving. Down in the village, a fire crackled in the square. Voices rose in an old song, one about the mountain, the wind, and the people who walk between them. The schoolteacher stood, brushed the dust from his pants, and began the slow walk home. He passed children playing near the water filters, now used only for special occasions like festivals or when travelers came. They'd stopped relying on them. They'd dug a new spring channel by hand, lined with stones their grandparents had placed generations ago. The water wasn't sterile. It tasted of earth and time, and it was theirs. Inside his house, his journal lay open on the table. The page titled Deathworlders was still there, but below it he'd written new words. "We are still here." He didn't write for fame. He wrote so the next generation would know. When strangers come offering salvation, look past their hands. See what they're not saying. See what they want to take. Because real help doesn't ask you to forget who you are. It helps you remember. That night, as he lay on his mat listening to the wind through the eaves, he felt no fear, no bitterness. Just a deep, quiet peace, the kind that comes not from being rescued, but from standing your ground and finding you were never alone. The mountain breathed. The stars watched. And the village, small and unbroken, slept under the same sky that had once seemed so silent. But now, if you listened closely, whispered back in the language of roots, rivers, and resilience.